Welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Telemedicine, Changing Consumer Behavior and Expectations. This webinar is brought to you by Premier Academy 360. Attend webinars like this one or visit our content library and on-demand learning at learnacademy360.com. Q&A will be provided at the end of this presentation. Please chat in your questions anytime during the webinar. We want to hear from you and continue to provide the content you want. Please stick around after this presentation and answer our survey poll. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Angie Jones. Angie manages the market research team at VSP Global and has been with VSP for 9 years. She previously managed research studies for Fortune 500 consumer packaged goods companies. Angie has 20 years of experience in the field of market research, including quantitative, qualitative, and secondary research methodologies. She is heavily involved in consumer segmentation research at VSP and has a passion for exploring the intersection of consumer psychology and market research. Angie is a graduate of San Jose State University, where she received a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration with a concentration in marketing. Welcome, Angie.
Thanks, Lauren. So before I dive in, I just want to go over a quick agenda before we get started to give you a sense for what I plan to cover today. So my goal is to answer these 4 questions for you. And I want to be clear that the answers to these questions are not black and white. They're actually quite complex due to COVID-19 and all of the other changes that we're all experiencing in our lives right now. But that said, we've culled through a wealth of information on this topic, and everything from data in the broader healthcare space and trends that are happening with telemedicine in the larger healthcare forum. We have data from vision industry partners such as Jobson and Vision Council, and then we have data from our own VSP members. We do a lot of primary research with our members to understand what's on their minds. So we have a lot of great information to share today. I will be honest, it's changing rapidly. We are constantly looking at the newest and latest and greatest. So I'm pretty confident that today what we have to share is the best that we can get our hands on. And I think you're going to get some solid answers to these questions. Lastly, before I jump in, I want to mention that I'll be using 2 different terms throughout the presentation. I'm going to be talking about telemedicine and telehealth and using those terms somewhat interchangeably. There are differences between those terminologies. I'm aware of that, but I am pulling, like I mentioned, data from third-party sources, and I didn't want to change the accuracy or what was used in those bits of research that we pulled. So just know that I'm aware of the 2 different terms, and then also know that generally speaking, from what we know about our members and what we know about consumers in general, they don't really see differences between the terms. So any research that's been conducted with consumers on this topic, it's unlikely that their responses or the feedback would have changed based on the nuances between those 2 words. So just wanted to call that out. So let's get started. First question, will consumers embrace telemedicine? Well, I don't want to drag this out much longer, but in order to answer that question, it helps to take a look at the bigger picture and the state of the world at this moment in time with COVID-19. The reality is that the longer this pandemic continues, the more significant changes we're going to see in consumer behavior. If everything had peaked in the first few weeks back in March, or if a vaccine had become available quickly, our lives likely would have gone back to normal. But that's not the case, and so we can expect to see some permanent changes in consumer behavior as a result. And it's also clear that there are some different and oftentimes polarizing views about what consumers feel is acceptable at this moment. And so not all behaviors and new behaviors are going to be universal. So some people are going to have different beliefs. So let's talk, though, about things that are a little bit more universal. So I think we can all agree that COVID-19 has transformed the way that we communicate. On a personal level, on a professional level, people are changing the way they communicate with one another. This is a great example from Zoom. So Zoom went from 10 million daily participants back in December 2019 and is, as of April, 300 million daily users. So just an exponential growth in new technology and new platform for a lot of people. These are platforms and technologies that a lot of younger generations were using. Is very common for them, but some of us not as comfortable with video chatting and those types of things, but they're becoming more commonplace. And that interaction is really going beyond your inner circle. Whereas you might have FaceTimed with your family members, now you're FaceTiming with teachers and doctors and strangers even to get your needs met. So as with most things with consumers, the more they're exposed to something new and they see the benefits, the more likely those behaviors are going to stick long term. And the same goes for other types of services. So consumers are trying out new things for the first time. You'll see a list here from some research, home delivery of groceries and streaming services, contactless payment options. So this data is from some research back in April looking, I want to have you focus on that telemedicine line specifically. At the time of the survey in late April, 8% of consumers who had never tried telemedicine services prior had given it a try for the first time. And those same people were asked if they would likely use those services in the future. And you can see going from 8% who had tried it, of that 8%, 61% said they would likely use it beyond the crisis. And so that really aligns with some of the other data that we're seeing in the broader healthcare space about adoption with telemedicine. So the telehealth market is expected to grow 80% year over year, and that is staggering in the world of business when you think about that type of growth. That's due in part to new regulations and the need to provide remote care during this global pandemic, obviously. But it is expected that adoption will increase beyond the pandemic. So, how much and to what extent is still debatable. And again, those numbers are changing all the time. But let's take a closer look at what that change looks like for the general population. So I also want to pause and mention I'm showing a lot of numbers and data. So I know there's a lot going on the slide. So I'm going to walk you through. Don't worry. I'm going to kind of help you focus on what the story is in the data. So if you look at the blue line specifically, you'll see that in December 2019, roughly 8% of consumers had used telemedicine services. And we're talking, again, in this broader healthcare space, telemedicine in general. And as of May, that number jumped to 29%. So we're seeing with that blue line this upward trend. What's also interesting is if you look at the green line, so the blue line is those that have used it already. The green line are those that say they intend to use it in the future. So we're seeing some fluctuations with those that have an intent to use telemedicine. It seems like their intent peaked in March, and there's a slight decrease after that. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit more as we go throughout this hour, but we suspect that a lot of that has to do with people really just not understanding what telemedicine is all about. And as things open back up, if they feel like, hey, I can go back to my doctor in person, I don't really need to get over the hump of learning something new, that will be their preference. But I think regardless of those that haven't used it yet, what's really the story here is that steady increase in that blue line of those that have used it is steadily increasing, right? So we can see that telemedicine in general is getting some traction overall. And we do expect, like I mentioned before, this trend is likely going to be in place at least through this global crisis that we're in. So likely until a vaccine is widely available. And again, we can't predict quite when that will be, but I think more than likely we can confidently say that for the next year, we're going to see an increase in people using telemedicine services. And I think it's important to note that those consumers that are using telemedicine options, their satisfaction is quite high. Over 70% who've tried it in the past 3 months have reported a positive experience. And I have this image here of the J.D. Power Award. J.D. Power is one of the sources of consumer satisfaction data, and they have reported that their scores for telemedicine services are among the highest of all of healthcare industry services that they test, insurance and financial services as well. It's like really staggeringly high satisfaction with telemedicine. And providers are getting more comfortable as well. So I thought these stats were particularly interesting. 57% of providers view telehealth more favorably than they did before COVID-19, and 64% are more comfortable using it. So if you think about the fact that this is really kind of going back to March, right? If you talk about before COVID-19, February maybe, it's really been a short amount of time for doctors to get up to speed and try something new. And so they are realizing there is a place for telemedicine. And then again, the debate really is just, how much will it be used and for what things will it be used? So I've drawn this out long enough, kind of going back to the original question, will consumers embrace telemedicine? Not only does the broader research suggest that it is indeed here to stay in some way, shape, or form, and if you Google this question, and that's what I actually did here, you Google the question, will consumers embrace telemedicine? You're going to find a ton of headlines just like these that do imply that the industry experts expect that telemedicine is here to stay. Excuse me. So I want to move on to the next question. How is telemedicine evolving in optometry specifically? So we've talked about that broader telemedicine usage in the healthcare space. So what is it looking like for optometry specifically? There's a lot going on this slide. I'm a data person. I realize now that everybody is, so I'll help walk you through this. I know it's pretty cluttered. But if you focus on the orange arrows, the one in the middle, particularly the chart in the middle with the orange arrow going upward, this data is from a Jobson tracking study, and they have been tracking the sentiment of eye care professionals since March, when a lot of this began. So if you look at that middle section where the orange arrow is pointing upward, you'll see an overall increase over time in eye care professionals saying that they've started offering telehealth services. So 5% back in mid-March were offering some sort of telehealth service, and 38% as of this last wave, which was the end of May. In fact, right before about an hour and a half ago in my email box, I got an update to this study of the next wave, and the data is still tracking the same. There's still kind of this slight upward trend in ECPs offering telehealth services. And subsequently, the orange arrow pointing down is showing that the number of providers saying that COVID-19 has not influenced their consideration is going down. So overall, there's a pretty high level of doctors saying that they also, not only are they offering telemedicine services, but they plan to continue. And the debate really is, how long do they plan to continue that? So this next slide kind of follows that same story, right? So it follows that billing for telehealth services has also increased over time. So this is looking at that same time period in March, mid-March, late March, 26% of eye care professionals were billing for telehealth services. And now at the end of May, we're at 59%. But you'll notice a little bit of a difference with this chart versus the other one. The other one was, going straight upward, and this one is starting to have a little bit of a curve back down. So it seemed like there was a peak in April of providers billing for telehealth services, and then it sort of gradually started to come back down. And that makes sense if you think about it. It's likely due to the easing of restrictions that happened in some states, and practices opening back up, and people having more option to go to their doctor in person. And so that question becomes whether the volume of telehealth services build will continue to go down as things open up? Will it go away over time? Like what is going to happen here? And a lot of that really depends on the comfort level of consumers. And so let's dig into that a little bit more. Again, I realize a lot going on in the slide. So this data is also a few weeks old at this point, but I also had an update. Forgive me, I really, these numbers are changing almost daily. And so no matter how much you put together and try to get things up to date, it's always changing. The story is trending the same, but with little nuances. So I can tell you that I looked at an update for this data, and consumer concern about COVID-19 seems to have peaked in early April, and then it sort of dipped down a little bit since that. And I'm looking at that yellow line on top. And basically, the newest data is showing that this isn't a perfect bell curve. It's peaking in early April, it's coming back down, but it's flattening out at this point. It's sort of starting to remain steady. It's leveling off. And that makes sense if you think about the fact that some areas that removed shelter-in-place restrictions, there's rumors and speculation that there might be increases in coronavirus cases after things open back up. So that is happening in some cases. So consumers are conflicted. They're having a difficult time understanding, is it safe to go back to my doctor? Should I be concerned? As probably many of you are feeling, there really is no right answer. And in this case, there's still around 40% of consumers that say that they will plan to postpone or cancel their eye exams. And that's scary when you consider all of these new behaviors that people are doing, that they're impacting their vision. So we've got millions of working adults that are now working remotely. They're meeting via video conference. Their children, kids and college students are doing distance learning, and they're also meeting virtually over screens. Some are choosing glasses over contacts. Who knows if their prescription for their glasses is up to date? Do they have blue light filtering lenses? There's a lot of opportunity right now to be educating and talking to patients about their vision and their changing use of how they're using screens. So if consumers are delaying care at a time when they're spending more time on their screens, it seems like there is an opportunity to encourage telemedicine services. But the question is, are consumers really ready for it? Are they ready for telemedicine solutions with their eye care provider specifically? And I can tell you that the data suggests consumers are definitely intrigued. They're intrigued by telemedicine, but not all of them are ready for it. And this data, again, I'll walk you through it here. If you look at the red bar versus the blue bar on this chart, you'll see younger consumers are much more open to virtual vision care and than the older consumers. And the percentage of adults in general that are hungry for these options on an ongoing basis, it's still relatively small. So why is that? We've done a lot of research. This is some quotes from research that we've done with VSP members. We added some COVID-related questions and some telemedicine-related questions to our most recent member satisfaction survey. And we noticed a common theme among those that are kind of on the fence about whether telemedicine services make sense in that eye care space. And the reality is that they just don't get it. They're intrigued. In fact, the quote there in the blue bubble says that specifically, I'm intrigued, but they can't quite envision what it would look like. And if they can't envision it, then it starts to make them wonder if it can be trusted. And that leads me to another bit of research that we did with members. We directly asked them if they have any concerns about using telehealth for their current eye care needs, during this pandemic. And over 80% had at least some sort of concern. And then if you focus then on the word cloud on the right here, these are themes that came out of the open-ended question that we asked, just type in what your concerns are, and we let them type away. And this word cloud shows that there are kind of the two biggest concerns are, how does this work? How would this work? And is it accurate? So they're intrigued, but the ambiguity is really leading them to not feel super comfortable saying that that's something that they would try. So there are definitely some hurdles, and consumers have a lot of questions before they're ready to embrace telemedicine. But they are clear that they are hungry for more options, right? They want to have the choice when they're ready. We asked a number of questions, and I'm showing you some results of those questions here. But ultimately, we saw that 2/3 of our members are open to using telemedicine for their vision care needs, if they're urgent needs and they really need to see someone and they really want to practice social distancing. 2/3 are open to it for urgent care. 42% are at least somewhat likely to use it in their minds, but 70% want the option. Regardless of whether they're ready for it right now, 70% want the option. And so I think at the end of the day, we can debate whether telemedicine is here to stay and whether consumers are going to embrace it. But there's always, everything that we know from consumer behavior and consumer research that we do, there's always this added perception of value for consumers when they feel like they have options and they feel like they have a choice. So regardless of whether they use those options, there's this extra layer of feeling like they're getting, they've got the most comprehensive plan and most comprehensive care that is out there if they have the choice of what they would like to do. So I think diving a little bit deeper, future use really depends on what it's being used for. So that's something that was clear in the research as well. There's a high level of comfort using it for follow-up visits. 73% are comfortable with that. But only 42% are comfortable using it to monitor eye health conditions. For something like that, they would like to visit a doctor in person. So I think the other thing that's important to note here is that with all the research we've reviewed, it's clear that the doctor recommendation is key. Patients are open-minded, and they're open-minded to trying telemedicine services if it's encouraged or recommended by their doctor. They just really need to understand what the process looks like, and anything that's ambiguous is going to raise questions. Okay, so next question, who is most interested and why? So not surprisingly, younger consumers are more open to telemedicine and virtual eye care than older consumers. And I think it's also not surprising that those that most recently visited a retail chain or purchased eyewear online are more likely to seek out alternative services than those who most recently visited an independent practice. So that's not really all that surprising. And it really brings me to something that we've worked on a lot at VSP over the past few years, and that's our consumer segmentation research. We've really learned, and we know that a one-size-fits-all approach to vision care doesn't work. Consumers behave very differently depending on whether they have access to vision insurance. They behave very differently depending on their age and the life stage that they're in. And so I just wanted to share with you a few updates from our consumer segmentation research around kind of three different groups: younger millennials, parents, and retirees. So millennials are more interested in telehealth than other age groups, and we already mentioned that earlier. But over these past few months, we've also learned that millennials are the group that is most likely to have lost their job or lost their benefits. And as a result, they plan to extend time between visits to their eye doctor. So that is a group that has some unique challenges around how they're going to get care. Parents. Parents are a group that is likely to be proactively thinking about eye care right now, the eye care needs of their families. They're thinking about their kids being on screens more often. But the reality is, in their world right now, they've got some logistical challenges to overcome when trying to run a busy household, work from home, keep their family safe. they really have some concerns about what the right thing to do is in terms of getting eye care needs met right now. And then the retiree group is the least interested in telehealth. And I'm saying retiree, really it's kind of more that 65 plus group, retired or not. They're more likely to value a personal interaction with their doctor and that relationship that they built with their doctor over time because their needs are more complex. And they are the group that's most likely to prefer in-person care. So I think the point that I wanted to make here is that in order for telemedicine to be effective, you really need to think about your patient demographic, right? And think about what it will take to meet the individual needs of each of your different types of patients that are in your practice. And then one last thing that we touched on in our research was we recently asked members to rate what they saw as the biggest value in telehealth. And not surprisingly, during this time, social responsibility, being socially responsible, and maintaining physical distance topped the list as to why telehealth would be valuable to them. That's not surprising at this moment in time. I can tell you that the other two that popped up high on the list were flexibility and convenience, and that's what usually pops up outside of a moment like this. So flexibility and convenience are really the reasons why people would value telehealth solutions. So that was that section. And then I want to get to the last question, which is, should eye care professionals consider telemedicine? So we've had some data that suggests it's really trending in the healthcare space. We've had some data to suggest that in the optical space, there are some opportunities, but it's not for everybody. So what should eye care professionals do? I want to preference this last section with a caveat here that I'm not an expert in telemedicine. I am not qualified to give strategic advice to optometrists, but I'm sharing with you data from a number of different sources that touch on some key questions that the data suggests providers should be asking right now as they decide on what their telemedicine strategy should look like in the future. So I think these questions are really valuable to consider as you try to answer these questions. First, be clear about your primary goal. What are you hoping to achieve? That should really drive your overall decision and strategy. So are you trying to get through this COVID-19 risk period and you just need some sort of temporary solutions for your patients? Or are you looking to offer services beyond this moment in time? And if so, what is your goal from there? Are you looking to attract a new demographic? Are you looking to increase efficiencies? Which of these are you most passionate about? Or is it perhaps it's something else altogether? But I think really exploring what your primary goal is will really help drive how deeply you invest in the solution that's going to best meet your needs. Another question to consider is, who is your target? So you know your practice and your community best. What are the unique needs of your patient population? Who could benefit the most? Will offering telemedicine services help you differentiate your practice from others in your area? And these are only things that you can answer, but I think these are the right questions to be asking at this moment in time of who are you really doing this for? Who is your target? And then are you able to support telemedicine effectively? Is your practice set up or is there still some work that needs to be done? Do you have a well-defined workflow to support virtual visits? How will you support patients through the experience? We know that they have some concerns and some questions and they don't quite get it just yet. So how are you going to support them through the experience? Do you have electronic forms and bill pay options? Will you have the opportunity to integrate a solution with some common technology platforms that consumers are used to? Zoom, Google Calendar, these are things that people are using and familiar with that might just help them get over the hump with learning something new. And then if you decide to move forward, it's important to have some sort of marketing strategy, or at least some sort of messaging to help consumers understand what telemedicine is all about, particularly in the world of optometry. So what are the value propositions that will resonate best with your patient demographics? They really want to know what's in it for them. So I briefly mentioned earlier that social distancing and social responsibility topped our list in terms of value with members. But we've also seen some pretty polarizing comments in our research on this topic. I just wanted to be clear. It resonates with some. It's a hot button for others. So really be sure to consider whether that messaging will resonate with your patient base and where you are, your state in terms of, restrictions and stay-in-place orders. Are you having another wave of a spike in coronavirus cases? So really figuring out what the right messaging is to speak to patients about telemedicine solutions. Or perhaps you want to focus more on things like convenience or enhanced patient outcomes. Either way, patients really just want to understand what's in it for them. So having some sort of elevator pitch or messaging of some sort that you or your staff can explain easily will help with adoption. And then finally, don't forget about the importance of patient education. As I mentioned earlier, consumers do have some concerns. They don't have a point of reference for what telemedicine will look like in the world of optometry. They need it spelled out, and they need it spelled out pretty clearly, and they need examples. And, even things like positive reviews from others that have experienced it will go a long way in helping with adoption. I realize that the graphic on this page is quite small, and no one's going to be able to read those tiny words. But I just wanted to show this quick visual example. I thought it was helpful. It came from a source in the broader healthcare space, and it was an attempt to educate patients on the options that were available to them for different types of care. It's detailed, but it's also clear. It's kind of got these 4 quadrants that are really clear, and it gives patients options for recommendations for the different types of services that they can seek out. And I know I've said this multiple times, but I think it really is kind of the underlying learning from all of the research that we've done, is that what we know about consumers is they, in times like these specifically, they really do want those options, and they're going to go with their doctor recommendation at the end of the day. They're likely going to have some concerns in the beginning, but just knowing those options are available to them is a bonus. Okay, so kind of breeze through some of that. We're going to definitely have some time for questions, but just to recap quickly with what we've learned through our research, what we know about consumer behavior in general, we feel pretty confident that telemedicine is here to stay. So again, you can debate whether consumers are going to be slow to adopt, particularly in the optometry world, but it is growing exponentially outside of optometry, and consumers are highly satisfied with their experience. So we can expect that the more consumers get comfortable with it, the more they're going to expect these types of services to be available across all of their healthcare providers. I actually came across a really interesting parallel that somebody drew between telemedicine and online banking. So if you think about online banking, there was a lot of concern from consumers in the beginning about, well, is my data safe? Is it safe to conduct banking transactions online? This is really new. It's very different. And so you had early adopters that were all in from the beginning. They just saw the benefits right away, and they gave it a try. And then you had holdouts that still to this day are not comfortable with online banking. But in general, as time went on and consumers learned that those early adopters didn't have any severe repercussions of using online banking services, they started to slowly get more comfortable with the idea as well. So similarly with telemedicine, it's likely that we're going to see kind of this growing momentum because there is so much momentum in the healthcare space. And that really just leads consumers to start to expect those types of things to be available to them across the board. So I think that that's pretty clear. We're confident that it is here to stay. It just may look a little bit different out of the gate for optometry. And I've probably made this point abundantly clear, but while it's not for everyone, consumers want the option, right? So they just want to know there are some options and choice available to them. And then when you're considering what telemedicine strategy makes the most sense for your practice, be sure to consider your different patient types and what the overall message might be for your target audience. And then lastly, be sure to ease your patient concerns and help them envision how this would work for vision care in order to increase adoption and get the return on your investment in any telehealth services that you embark on. So that is what I had to share at this point. Lauren, I believe we're going to open it up to questions.
Yes, thank you, Angie. We'll now begin the Q&A segment. So as a reminder, please submit your questions using the chat feature. We do have a couple that have come in, so I'll go ahead and start you off. The first question is, prior to COVID, only certain telehealth programs were allowed by insurances. Obviously, the field got opened up during the pandemic. Do you think that it will be restricted again in the future?
That's a great question, and I will be honest, I don't know the answer. I don't know if anybody does, and I will pause and mention to you, Lauren, if there are any, I don't know if there are any VSP folks on the line that have more information than I do on this topic. Feel free to let me know if there are, and if they have more information than I do. I think it's yet to be seen. I think everybody's waiting to find that out, but I think the more all of us learn about, whether there are any serious repercussions from allowing some of these loosened restrictions, if there aren't any serious repercussions, I think we're going to see some leniency going forward if the pros outweigh the cons, right? But I think it's too early to say, and it's definitely something that we're keeping a pulse on, but I don't know that anybody has a specific answer to that just yet. And I can understand why that's a burning question. But as I mentioned, if that's something you can work into your plan and just assume for worst case scenarios even, there's still some value in pushing forward and figuring out if there is a target demographic within your practice that can really benefit from this, regardless of whatever restrictions might be coming your way in the future.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, do consumers trust the quality of care and consultation when it's virtual rather than in person? Yes, generally speaking, yes. There actually is some recent research by a company called YouGov. They're a pretty reputable survey polling company, and it shows a pretty significant jump in consumers' comfort level with telemedicine over these last few months specifically. And I believe it's something like 75% of consumers, like two-thirds of consumers are comfortable with it now versus like 60-65% prior to COVID. And that comfort comes with having positive outcomes. So while quality care is obviously, it's important to all members, some are much more concerned about that than others. You heard me talk about the older demographic and those with eye health conditions, for example. Those that are 65 or older, they really prefer that in-person care when it comes to any sort of new or developing conditions that they're dealing with. And so they might not trust the quality of a virtual exam, and it might not be the right, and I said virtual exam, I didn't mean virtual exam, but virtual care. They might not trust it, and so it might not be the right solution for that audience, for example. But everybody has different
places different value on the quality of care. Some convenience is higher up on that list than anything. They just want their prescription refilled. They need to get their contacts, and they might go to retail, right? Like, we do have these different types of consumers with different needs. And so quality of care is obviously a priority across the board it should be for everybody. But generally, trust in that quality comes down to the relationship they have with their doctor. And if their doctor is confident in their ability to provide quality care virtually, then I think, and then if patients experience those virtual moments and they have a good experience, I think we'll likely see that comfort level continue to increase over time. So I think I kind of rambled in a couple different directions here, but the reality is they will trust the quality if they have a good experience, and if their doctor is confident in showing them that they can easily diagnose or at least easily provide direction virtually as to what the next step is in that person's care.
Okay, and kind of along those same lines, we have another question that is, what are some of the typical questions that consumers or patients have about telemedicine?
Yeah. They want to know common questions. Okay, they want to know, do I need any sort of special equipment or technology on the consumer end, right? Like, do I have to download an app? Like, what's going to happen? And that goes back to clearing up that ambiguity of, like, what does it look like? Spell it out for them. So that's a common question that consumers will ask. They want to know if their insurance is going to cover it. That's a very common question. They do, back to that original, that previous question, they want to know if their doctor can really know what's going on through a screen. Like, how does that work? How can they be confident that they're seeing everything accurately and understanding what I'm really experiencing? And then I touched on this a little bit here and there, but they do have some concerns about privacy and protecting their health data, right? So going back to that online banking example and drawing the parallels there, it's just as scary to put your banking information out there into the virtual world. And so I think we will find that with telemedicine, yes, there are questions and concerns, but over time, if people have a good experience, those questions will be answered as they realize, okay, it's maybe not as big of an issue as you worked it up to be.
Okay, that makes sense. And we're going to take one more question. We have time for one more. So the last question today is just more around the older generations and how they're responding to telemedicine. Could you talk about that a little bit more and, like, some of the things that make them more leery of it and less interested in trying it?
Yeah, and it's very clear through all of our segmentation research that those older generations value personal relationship with their doctor. They are much more likely to go to an independent private practice doctor than to go to retail or anywhere else. And they do that because they have more complex issues. Their vision deteriorates with age. It kind of goes hand in hand, right? And so they want to entrust their eye health to a doctor that they can build a relationship with and that they trust. So that has a lot to do with resistance or concern about telemedicine options. And I definitely don't want to perpetuate any dated stereotypes here. I know people say, oh, baby boomers aren't as tech savvy and all of that, but it's not necessarily true. But when you get into the more, say, senior populations, for example, there are some challenges with technology and access to technology or technical literacy. They do tend to be less open than younger generations when it comes to learning new technology, or there are just some gaps in terms of access to technology, and if they're under the care of someone else in their household and they can help bridge that gap, then it can work really effectively, because honestly, when you get into those older generations and mobility becomes an issue and the stress of having to leave your home and go to your eye doctor appointment, like that can be a downside as well. So there could be some really interesting opportunities with aging populations with telemedicine, but it is a challenge of, who's providing their care and do they have access to the technology that they need. So there are some challenges with that audience, but in general, I think they really just value that in-person interaction.
Yeah, those are some really good points. Okay, well, that concludes our time for questions today. Thank you for joining us, Angie. We really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And thank you to everyone who joined today's webinar. You should see a survey window on your screen. Before you log out, please take a moment to provide us with your feedback. We will be sending out an email with the recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of the slides. Recordings can also be found at learnacademy360.com. Be sure to check out learnacademy360.com for upcoming webinars and podcasts. Thank you.